Okay, we're gonna do this right now. Force Majeure is easily one of my favorite movies to be released in the last 10 years. I remember seeing the posters around art house theaters back in 2014 when it came out, but I was too busy rewatching Birdman probably to look into it at all. So here's a very quick intro to Force Majeure if you're not familiar with it. A bone-stock, seemingly perfect Swedish family visits a luxurious ski resort in Switzerland. While observing a controlled avalanche from a nice little veranda, Dad abandons the family when everything gets a little too scary, grabbing his phone and getting the heck out of there. No one was ever in danger, but this fun little story catalyst sets off a brutal, emotional boxing match that lasts for the rest of the movie. For now, I'll just say that the movie is objectively fantastic. It deals heavily with stereotypical masculinity, especially within a family setting, and the cinematography is just stunning, full stop. Prior to Force Majeure, director Ruben Östlund, that's as close as I'm getting with the pronunciation, had mostly made ski films and shorts. This movie didn't exactly make him a household name here in the US, but for art house fans like myself, he had just burst his way onto the scene. Force Majeure even had a strong shot at receiving an Oscar nomination that year. It didn't receive the nomination, but Östlund made a fun little video of his reaction to the announcement in which he mimics one of his favorite viral videos, which I'll show here. Östlund actually takes a lot of inspiration from viral videos in general, but we'll talk about that more in the full movie review, which is a whole separate thing. But here's the problem. Force Majeure got a remake this year, and that remake is called Downhill. Downhill stars Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus and was co-directed by Nat Faxon and Jim Rash, who also contributed to the screenplay. Rash and Faxon won an Oscar for their work on The Descendants, and both are also very successful comedic actors. You probably recognize Faxon's voice from Disenchanted, the mediocre Netflix show, and of course Jim Rash was the Dean on Community and was just fantastic. So on the surface, none of this sounds all that bad, but this remake is a very strange happening in a few different ways, and at least to me, it represents an interesting, if also kind of worrying, shift within the world of indie and art house cinema. Before we launch into the nitty-gritty here, I'll say now that this whole video is not a review of either Force Majeure or Downhill. The review of Downhill can be its own separate thing that's later on. This is just to talk about how strange the whole situation is as a whole, and why I was so disappointed to hear about this remake, and what I think it means for the future of indie movies here in the US. I also want to mention that there have already been some really excellent reviews of Downhill, among them the AV Club's wonderful overview of the whole situation, which you can take a peek at here. I'll be talking about these two movies from a pretty personal angle, and I'll be explaining why I think this particular remake is a very bad omen indeed. If that's something you'd be into, then throw on your toque and join me on the ski lift. First, I want to praise Force Majeure even more and elaborate on why I think it's an important movie, not just for art house snob guys like me, but for everyone who likes movies just in general. It really is a special movie. From the visuals alone, the movie announces itself very quickly. Within the first few minutes, I got that really special feeling that comes with any great masterwork. Just that feeling of, thank God, this movie knows exactly what it's doing, and I can just sit back and relax. When I trust the filmmakers and the cast, I'm ready to give a movie my undivided attention and wade through some slow pacing and all that kind of stuff, just because I know that I'll be rewarded in the end. Even if I don't enjoy the movie very much, I'll still be able to respect the artistry at work. But whereas a lot of impressive movies proceed to tell a downer story and leave viewers with just kind of a vacant expression of confusion and questioning, Force Majeure was entertaining the whole way through that first time I watched it. The whole movie is just funny and extremely uncomfortable at the same time, which is a combination that I don't think works well very often. It really has to be done well. But above all else, it was just quiet, slow, and sure-handed. I loved looking at the screen and waiting to see what happened next. I audibly gasped more than once just watching it alone in my room. And the down and dirty relationship dynamics of a waning marriage captivated me, despite having never been in that situation myself. It was kind of a train wreck movie, you know, where you're watching people go through something really challenging and horrible, but without ever being made to feel trashy, like you're watching fight videos on YouTube or something. The core of the movie is a challenge to traditional family structure and family dynamics. I mean, there are many unspoken rules at play and expectations of what people are supposed to do and act like based both on their gender and their familial role. I've heard Force Majeure described as a deconstruction of fragile male ego, and I agree with that interpretation. But it's also just one of the funniest comedies I've seen, and definitely one of the driest, too. Thanks in no small part to the fact that the movie is just plain smart and well executed. In summary, Force Majeure has a lot to say, and it says all of that very well. It's one of very few movies that dares to question societal norms that are shared all around the globe. Later on, I went on to watch Östlund's next movie called The Square, which won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and is very well received, and I was just as delighted with that one. But for the most part, I knew that Force Majeure would have a solid spot on my list of favorite movies, the kind of movie that I would recommend to very close friends after I'd known them for long enough. 3 years later, I got a text from a friend with a link to the trailer for some movie called Downhill.
Wunderbar.
Oh, thank you.
Die Hände in die Höhe.
Arms up like this.
Huh? Happy family.
Please look into the camera.
And from the very first shot, I recognized the imagery right away. I knew that I'd seen this trailer before. The trailer for Downhill is strikingly similar to the trailer of Force Majeure, not only in overall content and story, but even the shot selection and the bits of dialogue they chose to include. About 10 seconds in, it clicked for me. This was an American remake of a Swedish movie that had come out just a few years earlier. All of it felt wrong, or maybe not wrong, but just very, very different. Both Farrell and louis-dreyfus are decent actors, especially in the comedic space, but everything about it just felt really on the nose and blunt. Even the title, which a lot of other people have remarked on, is just like, we get it. Family's going through a rough patch. Things are downhill. Ba-dum. So I did my research, and yeah, well, there had already been plenty written about its differences from the source material, and a lot of info about Downhill showing at the upcoming Sundance Festival. This was maybe the only time I've looked at a trailer and just known right away that it was going to be a bad movie, or a movie that I just wasn't going to enjoy. I knew I wasn't going to like it, and I knew that professional critics would be smart enough to recognize the inferiority of this version because they'd almost definitely seen the original. For context, at the time of this recording, let's take a look at the Rotten Tomatoes scores for each of these movies. So there you have it. And no, Rotten Tomatoes isn't the be-all, end-all of movie criticism, and it's not even that good of a barometer for whether or not you in particular will like a movie or even want to watch something. But I happen to agree with the general sentiment here. Downhill was just unnecessary, strangely close to the original in both its release and story construction, and it calls to mind a whole bunch of questions about why it got made. So, why did Downhill get made? As the AV Club article explains, there was a strange phenomenon a while back where someone uploaded the famous inciting scene from Force Majeure, the avalanche scene, but the video was interpreted by viewers as just being real. And, I mean, to me, the footage, already looks cinematic, so I had a hard time believing that people thought this was a real thing, but they did, and that's fine. And from a filmmaking standpoint, it's actually pretty impressive that this scene, all by itself, which had, been uploaded to YouTube a long time ago on its own to promote the movie, had failed ultimately to really catch on and go viral and promote the movie. But now, years later, it had gone viral. You know, the director who loved pulling tone and even direct content from viral videos had very unexpectedly gone viral with some of his own work. So the less fun part of the surprise was the response from internet commenters. That's a big surprise, right? So there was a significant presence of like anti-men, anti-dad comments criticizing the character's actions, you know, the whole running away and ditching his family thing, and like, men are useless, and what was he should have known, he should have been strong, and, you know, blah, 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 done the thing. And yeah, his actions are worthy of criticism up to a certain point, and guess what? The movie goes into that a whole bunch. But the cinematic tragedy, the movie side of this whole thing, is this weird prying, insistent implication that the scene's status as a viral hit is what got this remake, Downhill, greenlit. And, you know, okay, I mean, like, let's all remember that this is just a theory for me. I don't have any insider information, and I'll be eager to watch, like, a behind-the-scenes featurette of Downhill if that ever happens to come into existence. But for now, it does, at least to me, seem like a pretty viable guess for why this movie ended up going into production. Remakes are nothing new, right? We all know just how common they are. And when it comes to established franchises, you can bet your sweet biscuits that there will be multiple remakes and reboots given enough time between each iteration. But here's where the Downhill situation differs in a couple different ways. Number one, this is very soon for a remake. Superhero movies have become the go-to example for franchises that dip into the same pot with greater and greater frequency. Batman is sort of the poster child for this. You know, the 90s Batman movies, they concluded in 1997 with Batman and Robin. Then, in 2005, Batman Begins started the Christopher Nolan trilogy. It's a gap of about 8 years. The gap between The Dark Knight Rises, released in 2012, and Batman v Superman, released in 2016, only 4 years later. Then you can take a look at the Spider-Man flicks very easily. The Sam Raimi movies wrapped up in 2007, and the Mark Webb Spider-Man movie started in 2012, about 5 years in between. The final Webb movie was released in 2014, and then Spider-Man Homecoming came out in 2017, a gap of only about 3 years. I guess he was also in Civil War, right? Which was earlier than Homecoming. I don't watch the Marvel movie. Then, in addition to all that, we got yet another Spider-Man, a different one, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse in 2018, just a year after we had started his whole new series. And, you know, sure, it also happens to be the best one, just by coincidence. So, if a studio has a treasured IP, they want to make as much money from it as possible. And if one attempt fails, they will try again. We all know this now. We have learned. But Force Majeure, getting a remake just 6 years after its release, not only is this still a pretty small gap, but it's also basically unprecedented in the Indian art house space, which leads to sort of concern number two. There haven't been many indie remakes of other indie and art house movies. So it gets tricky here because the definitions of indie and art house are amorphous and vague, so there's plenty of room for error. But for now, let's just say that the term indie refers to movies that don't come from one of the major Hollywood studios. Cool. So, I tried my best to find other examples of indie and small-scale movies being remade by indie studios, and I haven't had a lot of luck so far. You can kind of, sort of, make a case for some of the horror movie remakes. The original Texas Chainsaw Massacre definitely qualifies as like an indie movie or a B movie, but that remake came a whole 19 years later. And then there's The Fly, which is a remake of The Fly with a huge 28-year gap, and Cronenberg's version was distributed by 20th Century Fox, which is not an indie studio, so it's jumping from one to the other in that case. So do you see what I mean? Like, just try to imagine a remake of a more contemporary indie movie like Napoleon Dynamite or Pan's Labyrinth or Juno or Amelie or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. The reason I bother watching indie movies in the first place is because, for the most part, they're wholly original and very stylistic. Each one has its own voice, and it survives on its own merits rather than capitalizing on an established IP. They're not always good, a lot of them aren't, but at least they're different. And this is why Downhill's very existence bothers me so much, because for all the problems that I have with indie movies and American indie movie culture, I often reference indies as a hopeful segment of American media creation. In certain ways, I believe that remakes are a bad sign for American culture as a whole. I think that media serves as a kind of canary in the coal mine when it comes to the health of a particular society. When a movie does well, or really well, it tells us something about what we value and the kinds of stories and characters that we happen to connect with, and even our willingness or unwillingness to seek out new and interesting storytelling. So while the insane number of Hollywood remakes and reboots over the last 30 years is troubling, I could always say to someone, well, you know, at least there are cool things happening on the indie side, right? There have been some cool festival movies and small-scale stuff coming out. But now, because of Downhill, I'm kind of worried that even the indie scene has been infected with this same virus of regurgitation and homogenization. And if this movie only got made because somebody somewhere assumed that American audiences wouldn't be able to appreciate Force Majeure or be willing to watch a movie with subtitles, then that's pretty bad. And if it only got greenlit in the first place because the source material went viral, then that's even worse. The real kicker is that Force Majeure is readily available to American audiences and has been for quite a while now. It's on Hulu right this moment. You can watch it today on your friend's account for no additional charge. It's a complex movie, but it's not frustrating. You'll understand exactly what's happening the whole way through. The team behind Downhill is talented. I think these are pretty good screenwriters. You know, they're past works. The Descendants, it has heart. It's well written. You know, there's a lot of talent there. So how did Fox Searchlight? Just Searchlight. It's Searchlight Pictures right now. Why did they decide that this would be a good move? And now that this movie is tanking, both financially and critically, are other studios less likely to try the same stunt with some other slightly obscure properties? Maybe the creators aren't to blame here at all. Maybe this was just a studio scheme that didn't pay off. But this whole dang mess is at least interesting to me, and I'm still excited to talk about Downhill. You know, there might be some clues in the movie, and who knows, maybe this is some kind of elaborate Andy Kaufman-esque performance art piece meant to discourage this kind of behavior in the future, kind of like what Gus Van Sant did with his terrible Psycho remake. I'm really not sure, but I'd be happy to hear what other folks think. If there have been lots of other indie remakes of indie movies, I'd love to hear what they are. Please let me know. And if you haven't watched Force Majeure, now's the time. And that's it. I don't really make video essays. I watch a lot of them. But hopefully this was somewhat interesting. And you happen to find it one way or another. So, feel free to say hi and let me know what you think about all that business. And, bye.